Okay, so I'm picking up exactly where I left off in the last video. In this one, we're going to go very quickly over some techniques to solve some specific problems. And one of those problems is the one that I showed you in the previous video. If I just go back to this render over here that renders behind the camera, we saw that this is a problem with irradiance particles. Because irradiance particles are view dependent, very similar to the final gathering, we get this problem where nothing gets rendered from behind the camera. And this was a problem with Final Gathering. It still is. The fact that if you want to do any type of animation or say for example an architectural walkthrough animation or fly through, you're pretty much stuck because with Final Gathering you have to do a Final Gather pass, which means animating your camera and then going and creating this complex Final Gather map and going through this whole multi-stage process of rendering out and appending Final Gather points to a file, and you get this huge Final Gather map file, and it's very annoying. It's a very annoying workflow, very tedious and cumbersome. With Irradiance Particles, that problem is solved. As you can see, we have this problem here that's introduced based on the fact that IP is camera based. So how do we solve that using IP? If IP is causing a problem, how can IP solve it? Well, I'm going to show you that. Let's go back to our first camera view so we can actually see our scene back there. I'm going to clear out my script editor. Okay, to fix that problem, what we need to do is have more importance bouncing around in our scene, because the reason that's happening with the back of the camera is the fact that if we go over here to our importance settings, our diffuse bounces are set to 0. That means that our importance are being fired into the scene and they're not bouncing around. What we need is for those importance to fly from the camera, hit the walls and the objects in our scene, and bounce around several times in the scene. We need it to bounce around enough times to be able to fill in the entire room with enough importance to give us a very good result. So what we're going to need to do is increase the amount of importance as well as the diffuse bounces, also known as the trace depth of the importance. So to do that is actually pretty easy. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and knock the indirect passes down. I'm going to take the raise, knock that down to about 32. And the point interpolation, I'll leave that alone basically because it's not really going to hurt my render time or anything. I'm going to have to turn rebuild back on. And my importance are now set to a density of 0.07. Okay, which isn't really a lot of importance. So let's do a preview render here. And we're going to see we have about 9,520 importance, just under 10,000. That is not going to be enough. Okay, we're going to need a lot more importance than that. So in this particular technique, what we're going to do, we're going to need a high density of importance. We're going to need something higher, closer to the 100,000 range. Okay, so let's start to increase this number of importance. Let's increase it to about 0.1. See what that gives. That gives us only 13,000. So let's go to something like say 0.5. See what that gives us. Now the importance emission is going by a little bit slower. That's because we probably have a lot more importance now. Jumping up from 0.1 to 0.5 is actually a big jump. As you can see, we went from about 13,000 importance. Now we have 68,000, almost 70,000. So we're just under 100,000. That's perfectly fine. I'm not going to increase it more than that. The reason is because what I'm going to do now is increase my diffuse bounces. And if I increase the diffuse bounces, the number of importance is going to increase it as well. So I want to use a very high number of bounces. 0 is not going to cut it, and 1 isn't going to do it either. We're going to have to jump to something pretty high, something like 4. That way our importance can jump around and bounce around in our scene lots and lots of times. And now you can see the importance emission is actually taking longer. That's because we now have more importance. If you remember, we had about 68,000 before, just under 70,000. Now we're going to see how many importance we get from this. Now we get 174,000. That's a lot. So let's reduce our density down a little bit. I'm going to reduce it to 0.4. And remember, the target number I'm going after here is about 100,000. And 100,000 is actually more than enough for what we want to do. So you can see that the default setting before was 1. XSI likes to put the default setting to 1. And you can see here importance now are 151,000. So we still have a very large number of importance. So let's reduce it to 0.3 and see what that gives us. Okay, and like I was saying before, the importance density, the default value is 1. And 1 is just way too high. That really is an overkill number. and that's why the default settings take so long to render. They're not very optimized. So we have our density set to 0.3, and we can see that the number of importons is now at about 113,000. So I'd say that's pretty good. We went over our 100,000 mark by about 13,501 importons, but hey, I'm not really going to get picky about that. That's perfectly fine. And our diffuse bounces are set to 4, which is great. So now let's go back over here to Irradiance Particles, and we need to start to change some of these settings here. The next thing I want to do to get myself a really high quality render is increase my indirect passes. I'm going to need at least one indirect pass. You want to make sure though not to go crazy with that setting, because if you start to increase this to 2 or 3 or even 4, you're going to get some really long render times, and that's not what you want. So we're going to stick with one indirect pass, which, believe it or not, is actually more than enough. It's good enough, okay? Now, for the rays, we're going to have to shoot for a very high number of rays. 32 is obviously not going to cut it. So we have to increase the rays to get ourselves a good result, particularly because we're using pretty high density. Even though it's set to 0.3, our irradiance particles right now are working with over 100,000 importons. And the more importons you have, the more rays you need to smooth out the blotchy result that you're going to get. So we're going to need plenty of rays. I would say between 500 and 1,000 rays will solve the problem. So let's go with the minimum just to keep our render times as low as possible, because I'm going to be very, very cheap. So I'm going to put this to 500 rays, okay? And in terms of the point interpolation, because we're using high numbers like over 100,000 portons, and we're using 500 rays, which are actually pretty high numbers, we're going to reduce the number of interpolated points to 64. The reason for that is because the lower the point interpolation, the more accurate the render is going to be. However, it's going to create more artifacting. But because we're using 500 rays and we're using over 100,000 portons, it's going to offset the fact that we have a smaller number of interpolated points. And 64 points actually works well for most scenes, if not all scenes. Okay? Okay, so while this renders out, and it's actually not taking too long to render, well, let's just recap over these settings really quick. What I did was I took the number of importons and increased it to about 100,000, because we need enough importons in this scene to get ourselves a really good result. We increased the number of diffuse bounces so the importons would bounce around in our scene enough times so that when we freeze the map and we render from behind the camera, we can actually get a good result, as opposed to getting that nasty artifacting we got with the previous setup, okay, when we had no diffuse bounces. I increased the indirect passes so we get a nicer, brighter, more realistic looking IP map, okay? And of course, I increased the number of rays because we need a pretty good number of rays to get ourselves a high quality render. In the previous quick render we did in the last video, we only used about 256 rays, which was good enough for doing a simple scene with low details that has that you only going to render out a still as opposed to an animation. 256 rays worked well. But this scene, we're trying to do an IP map that's good enough for doing a walkthrough. Although I don't think anybody would be too interested in seeing a walkthrough of this particular scene. It's so simple of a scene that no one would really care. But of course, this is just to show you how to use it. So down here in interpolation, we have interpolation turned on with 64 points to give us a good balance between smoothness as well as accuracy. Okay, and we have environment turned off. We're not going to work with environment because, of course, this is a closed scene. There's no windows or anything. There's no environment. But we'll work with environment. Don't worry, I'm not going to skip that. We'll dedicate an entire video to environment later. Okay, so as you can see right now, it's computing the indirect passes, which is this setting up here. Remember that every time you add an indirect pass, you're going to increase your render time by a lot. So that's why I'm only sticking to one. And also, the more rays you have set up, the longer this phase here is going to take. So while it's computing indirect passes, if you have a ton of rays like me, I have 500 rays, which is actually a lot, believe it or not, we're going to have a very slow indirect pass computation phase. So you can see it's only at 10%, 11%. It's going by pretty slow. But although you may think that, well, this really stinks, it's going by so slow. When it finishes, we're going to have a great IP map that we can use for walkthroughs of this scene. So we won't have to work with photon maps. We won't have to work with setting up a final gather map pass for an animation. And then if we decide to change the camera animation, we have to redo the final gather map pass. With this, you just render out this IP map once one-shot deal, and when you're done, you can do whatever you want with your scene. You can spin the camera around, flip it, turn it, throw it around in your room, and the render will come out real nice every time because of a good, high-quality, solid IP map. So, with that said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a little break here. I'm going to let this thing finish. I'm going to pause the video and skip fast forward so we can see the end result. I suggest you do the same thing, so if you're in the mood for some coffee or lunch or anything, go ahead and do that now. Alright, so it finished rendering. We could see the wall clock here is about 33 minutes. So it took half an hour to go ahead and render out this IP map, and you're probably thinking, well, that's a pretty long time. I don't want to wait half an hour. Well, the benefit to doing this, I'm going to show you right now. If I turn rebuild off, see, it keeps rendering. It doesn't have to rebuild the IP map. Well, let's do this. Let's switch to that behind the camera view and see what happens. There you go. Because of the settings that we used, 500 rays, and we allowed the importance to bounce around up to 4 times, we were able to fill in behind the camera with indirect illumination using Irradiance Particles perfectly fine. So this looks really good. The only thing I have to do is increase the anti-aliasing to get myself a good final render image. So if this was, for example, an architectural scene I'm doing for a client or whatnot, I can go ahead and, well, for this particular scene, render out an IP map in about half an hour, and then every render after that is going to render out lightning fast because it doesn't have to calculate the IP map anymore. And since we created a suitable IP map, a high quality one that's perfect for doing walkthroughs and animations, we don't have to worry about areas that are behind the camera, because unlike with Final Gathering, with IP, we were able to fill in those areas in one shot, just making one IP map. Now we don't have to worry about creating a Final Gather map pass or an IP map for every single frame. There's no need to do that. Just create one IP map and you are good to go. So I can come in here, let me say, I'll close that, I'll close all this stuff, and I'll just move my camera around in my scene, and as it refreshes, you'll be able to see, let me zoom in here a little bit closer. There we go. And you can see that the entire room has been filled with a proper IP map. So I can just turn this camera anywhere I want, and I can get myself a nice indirect illumination to my scene. Now again, this is all camera and image resolution dependent. So I can't just go ahead and render out a larger image. If I go over here and go to my pass options, and I say increase this, I'll double this from 450. 450 times 2 is, I believe, 900. I'm not very good at math. So I'll do a render preview at this size. Still looks pretty good, but you'll see that there's lots of artifacting, especially here with the column and also with the room, with the walls itself. The reason that's happening is because since importans are dependent on the camera position as well as the image resolution, you have to make sure that when you're going to create your final IP map, you create it based on the image resolution of your production render. So if you're doing a production render that's going to be 900 by 608, for example, you have to make sure when you create the IP map to create it when you with a render of 900 by 608. Okay, because if you do it at 450 like I did, it's only going to look good at a size of 450, as we can see. So that's very important to understand. And also, you're not going to get a very good detailed IP map if you render out at a size of about 450, as you can see. And if I get really close to the column here, you can see a little bit of artifacting. And the reason that's happening is because the camera was positioned pretty far, and we're using a very small image, only 450 by 304. So it's only good for doing previews. When you do your final render, you want to make sure that you go ahead and render this out at the final image size that you're going to use for your final production render. Okay, so before I end this, I want to show you one more quick little trick here. I'm going to do a render from this angle here, and you can see that our scene is lit up pretty well. Let me lock that render down. Let me go over here, go to my renderer options, and let me see. Okay, so here's my Irradiance Particle settings. Really high settings, looks really good. Took a half hour to compute this, but you can see that our scene is a little bit light, and our intensity is set up at 1. We can actually lower the intensity, and we don't have to rebuild the map. We can just refresh this, and it'll be darker. As you can see, it does get darker. But I'm going to leave the intensity at 1. I'm going to show you a different trick that we can use here. Let me refresh that. Okay, it's rendering really quick. Okay, let me open up my material manager by hitting Control and 7. And if you remember, the materials that I use for my scene are all mental images or mental ray architectural shaders. This architectural shader here is a mental ray shader, and it's being used for all the shaders that I'm using in my scene: the white, the yellow, the red, and the green walls. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Control and I'm going to select all of these shaders, with the exception of the scene material, which is just a Phong shader. So I'm going to select the green, red, white, and yellow. Okay, and then what I'm just going to do is I'm going to hit Enter to open up its PPG. Okay, and it's going to be a shared PPG. So let me close the material manager and let me lock this down. And the architectural shader has a neat feature to it. If we go to the Ambient Occlusion tab over here, we can enable Ambient Occlusion. So if we go ahead and enable that, and let me do another preview render here. Let me just move it down here. Okay, you notice that it's a lot brighter. The reason it's brighter is because of the settings that we're using here. Okay, we're using max distance of 1, which is not good enough. What we have to do is increase that max distance. So let's go ahead and increase it and watch it update. And you can see there isn't much difference between the before render up here and the after render down here, except for the fact that the after render is a little bit brighter. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the detail enhancement. Detail enhancement has mode 0, which is the one we see now. You can also set it to mode 1 and mode 2. We're going to go ahead and use mode 1. Now, if we use detail enhancement mode 1, what we get is a more detailed image. We get ourselves some ambient occlusion on the corners and on any areas where there's some occlusion going on, and it just helps the image to look more realistic. And this is a very proper and very good and physically accurate way of using this ambient occlusion parameter. So let's actually increase this all the way to 100. We can see we get a very nice result. So we get a little bit of darkening where we need it. So you can see between the two images, on the top image we have no darkness here. We just have some color bleeding, which doesn't look exactly too good. But down here we have color bleeding and we have some darkening up of the image, which is actually very good and looks a little bit more realistic. The shadows look more pronounced, more realistic, and everything just looks a lot nicer. It looks more balanced out. So it looks nice and bright with indirect illumination, but at the same time we have some nice ambient occlusion going on there, which looks pretty good. And then of course we would increase these samples to something like 32 or 64, whatever actually looks good. Okay, and once we're done with that, we close that. Remember that that ambient occlusion setting is built into the mental ray architectural shader, and you would have to set that up for all the shaders in your scene. So I used mental ray architectural shaders for everything in this scene, so I was able to just go ahead and open up a shared PPG and set up that parameter for all the shaders in one shot. So there we go. So we got ourselves an even nicer image than before. I prefer the image on the right over here, the one with the ambient occlusion. To me, it looks a lot more realistic, a lot more plausible, and a lot more accurate in terms of lighting, and just a lot more pleasing. But of course, you don't have to do that if you don't want. Okay, so that's going to cover the technique for using interpolation with Irradiance Particles, how to get yourself a nice fast render. And as we saw, by freezing that map, we're able to, I was outside the wall right there, we're able to get ourselves a nice render from pretty much, well, any angle in this scene. And that looks just fantastic. Let's look at this from the primary angle here. Beautiful. That's fantastic. Look at that. Got that nice darkening in. Got that nice indirect illumination bouncing around. And after creating that IP map that took half an hour, which really isn't that bad, now we're able to go ahead and render this from anywhere we want. So we can go ahead and use this scene. We could set up an animated camera if we want to spin around this column or to just move around this room. Okay, so it's a very simple example scene, but you can see that you can apply the same exact things that we did here, these same exact techniques and principles. We just take them over and apply them to a real production scene, like an architectural scene or something like that. And we will be doing that in this tutorial, but not yet right now. We still have some more stuff on Irradiance Particles to cover. So I'm going to end this video here. Hope you enjoyed that. In the next video, we have to continue working with Irradiance Particles because there's still plenty more to cover.